Do you love guns? Hi, Gene Kelly here, and I've always been passionate about firearms. I started gunsmithing and went to gunsmithing school when I was just 18. I've been a professional gunsmith for over 40 years now, and I'm a licensed Class II manufacturer. I've been teaching gunsmithing since 1993. Now, we started the Gunsmithing Club of America 15 years ago to create a place where people who shared our passion, both professionals and hobbyists, could find reliable, trusted information on real-world gunsmithing. We wanted to provide a place where our instructors could continuously teach our members, where both hobbyists and professional gunsmiths could share their experience and learn from each other. It's to be a trusted community with reliable information. We knew that it would be an extremely powerful resource and tool to preserve our gunsmithing knowledge, provide our members with an enjoyable experience, and as a place that actually protects our firearms freedoms by keeping our guns functioning properly. As a member of the GCA, you'll have access to over 400 hours of gunsmithing instruction and techniques on video, all by qualified instructors who are masters in the field. You will receive our monthly Gun Tech video magazine and print magazine. Plus, the GCA members' website contains almost 200 extremely detailed firearm disassembly and reassembly video courses, hundreds of product reviews, firearms evaluations, and industry interviews. The Gunsmithing Club of America is a one-of-a-kind organization. There's no other club or group specifically dedicated to the art, craft, and profession of gunsmithing. As a hobbyist or a professional, you'll find that this is your source for the knowledge you need. So feed your passion about guns and gunsmithing by being a member in a community of like-minded individuals. If this sounds like you, join us today.
Hi, I'm Bob Dunlap, and welcome to the course on trigger jobs on the AK47 and its family of guns, like the MAC-90 and all the other racy ones. This is the gun we're talking about. It should look something like this. It's designed by Alexander Kalashnikov, and they all look pretty similar, used by about 10 million different countries. The trigger job on them, or the trigger pull on them, tends to be kind of light, but you don't know when it's going to go. You just pull the trigger long, and someday it goes off. You don't really know when. What we're going to do is we'll make the trigger pull let off slightly heavier, but you're going to know exactly when it's going to go. And the trigger will feel more consistent, more precise. But before we start that, we need to learn a few basics about, or a few basic rules about what triggers or sear systems have to do. And you have to play by these rules, or you'll wind up with a unsafe or unsafe trigger mechanism. And a gun like this gun, if you go about it wrong, it'll multiple on you, and ATF takes a real dim view of that. So play by the rules. You're going to find the trigger job is easy. You can live with it. It feels real good, and ATF won't get mad and slap your wrist. I'm going to show you a little demonstration here, a little mock-up, and you pay attention. We have here a bunch of little wooden triggers and hammers made by some students of mine. And when I was teaching full time and the students didn't pay attention, each class I would talk about a subject or an area, and the next time the class met, I'd question them on this to see if they understood it. And if they were bad and didn't do their notes and didn't study and didn't understand, they couldn't answer the questions, and I would get real nasty with them and make them make these mock-ups, force them then to understand how it worked. Well, I did it in groups, so generally not one student made one, but 3 or 4 students made one of these little projects as a group effort. And it has a neutral sear, a negative sear, a positive sear, and the last one is a trigger job. I'll caulk them all. Okay. The first one is neutral. By neutral, we mean that the relationship between the sear and the full cock notch is such that the hammer will neither move forward or back when you pull the trigger. It'll sit still until the trigger or sear leaves the full cock notch. We'll pull this one. Notice that the hammer does not move until it's released. That's neutral. Neutral is not acceptable under most circumstances. If you have a double sear trigger system, then neutral is a necessity. Otherwise, we want it to be positive. The next one we have is a negative. On the negative, one or more of the angles, either the full cock notch or the trigger, is negative, so that it's trying to disengage itself from the sear, from the hammer. So we have a spring holding the trigger in place. We have a hammer pushing on the trigger, a negative cam angle trying to push it out of the way. We'll pull the trigger. You watch the hammer move. It's actually falling before it actually is released, and then it falls. The disadvantage of this system is it's just outright unsafe. If you drop the gun, or it vibrates, or you bump the hammer, it will fall. It's unsafe. Now, if it's off safe and the internal safeties, if it has it, aren't working, the gun would, of course, fire. The advantage to it, if you want to call it that, is that the weight goes down. So if we, with a neutral system, if we had a 4-pound trigger, we have a negative system, we might have a 2-pound cam action trying to disengage the trigger from the hammer, so the trigger pull becomes 2 pounds. Another disadvantage is that, and you will watch it on this one, as the trigger is pulled, the angle of the trigger, on this case the negative component, changes, doesn't it? It becomes less negative. See it? And so that the hammer loses some of the cam action. So to keep it moving once it starts, is you have to keep adding weight to the trigger to keep it going. So it may start off with a 3.5-pound pull and end up with a 4-pound pull. What it does then is enhances the felt creep. You think it's creepy. It feels creepy. So the disadvantage is unsafe, and it makes it feel creepier. This is a no-no. You never, never let it be negative. There's no case where you want a negative let-off sear engagement. It always needs to be the third one, positive. Now, positive, you see it re-engage. You see the hammer move back when I pull the trigger. On this one, then, it's trying to engage itself deeper. Both pieces are positive. When the hammer moves, when the trigger moves and starts to disengage the hammer moves back. In this case, you can watch the full cock notch of the hammer. It changes, doesn't it? As the hammer lifts, the full cock notch becomes less positive. So that on the positive system, when you go to pull the trigger, once it starts, it has a tendency to keep going. So it hides creep. In other words, the felt creep is less than a negative system where everything else is the same. So the advantages of positive are it's safe, it masks creep. The disadvantage is the opposite of the negative. The more positive it is, the heavier the trigger pull gets, because you have to cam the hammer back, which compresses the mainspring. That compression of the mainspring, of course, occurs when the hammer's cammed back, because we have a negative or poor mechanical advantage of the trigger to hammer camming it back, and so the weight goes up as you compress that spring. So of the three systems, the neutral system is only used in a double sear system or a triple sear system. The negative system is never used. The positive system is what you use on virtually all trigger mechanisms that you encounter. There are the exceptions of the double sear system. And the last one we have here for the show is a trigger job. Now, the trigger job is the same as the positive system, except we've bobbed off the sear so that it doesn't have as much engagement as it used to. And now the trigger doesn't move very much before it goes. Or on the positive system, without the trigger job, the trigger moves a long ways before it goes. Okay, with that under our belt, we'll get started on an actual trigger job on the AK. Now, this is for show and for you to understand, and you need to understand it. Go over the tape until you do. We don't want to make an unsafe trigger job. So understand it's positive, negative, and understand that you have to have positive on your actual let-off sear. Now the trigger job on the AK is a little bit different. We want to find out when it's going to go off, but if we don't reduce the amount of engagement, although we can, we don't reduce the amount of engagement. And with that, we'll get started. Before we actually start, I thought I'd show you my pile of tools for doing trigger jobs. The hammers to get the gun apart, put it back together. Punches for the same. I got standard, normal needle files and diamond needle files. I have a set of stones or a bunch of stones. I have a set of Allen wrenches for taking guns apart. I have round and flat files. I have emery paper and a Fordham tool for polishing and whatever. I have pliers and screwdrivers for getting the gun apart. And I have trigger pull weights. This is a weight system. It's very accurate. Then I have a Swiss system that's very accurate. But you can also get the gauges. Basically, it's a fish scale, accurate enough for most of us to do this at home. But when we have a target shooter that comes in and says, I want a 3.5 ounce trigger pull, 4 ounces ain't good enough. So we have a few of those. Anyway, I'm going to pop the top off of this. And this gun is a cutaway, so we can see inside of it. But I'm going to take the top off so you can see it a little bit better. Bear in mind that if you're going to do trigger jobs on your gun, you need to be able to take it apart and put it back together pretty easily because you're going to have to do it several times. So get familiar with that part, or better yet, buy the AJI Armors course video on that particular subject, on that particular gun. It'll tell you quite a bit of information. You can take it apart and clean it and fix minor stuff. You'll probably like it. But if you already know, go ahead and do the trigger job. If you don't, learn the gun. Get familiar so you can take it apart, put it back together easily. This system is not new. This system basically was developed by John Browning or designed by John Browning. The Browning A5 has it. It's not quite as complicated as this one. This one has two moving pieces, and the Browning system basically has one. But the idea is the same, and it's very common on guns. So we can use this trigger mechanism or this trigger pull adjusting system on many, many different guns, not just the AK47. You'll recognize it. You have a trigger, which is the primary sear system and holds the hammer back. We have a secondary sear system or disconnector back here that holds the hammer back when the gun cycles with the trigger pull. Now I'm going to pull the trigger, trigger's pulled, hammer comes back and pushes the bolt comes back and pushes the hammer back. And you see it's catching on the secondary sear system or the disconnect. It's now caught. When you let go of the trigger, the secondary sear system backs away and the primary system comes into play. It falls off of the secondary system and catches on the primary system. Then you pull the trigger, primary system lets go, the gun fires, cycles, pushes the hammer back, the secondary sear system catches it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the disconnector on this gun in such a way that when we pull the trigger, the disconnector will bump into the back of the hammer back here. You see that? It's close. Close now. We're going to make it hit it. Make it bump into it. It's hit my finger now, but yeah. Make it bump into it so that when it hits, the weight goes up and we feel it. We know then it's going to go off before much longer. Now, this weight is very light, and they are on AK-47. Before you start chopping and hacking, you want to check to make sure that your sear system is correct. Now remember, it has to be positive. You pull the trigger and watch the hammer gets cocked some more, doesn't it? That's what we have to have. It is positive. Now on these guns, it's relatively positive. You see that? So if it's real heavy and nasty, we might want to make it a little less positive. Remember, the sear system is as positive as the least positive component of it. That means that we could reduce it by changing the angle on the hammer or by changing the angle on the trigger. Frankly, in most cases, see it just hits on the edge of the hammer. It'd be easiest to change it on the trigger. Now before we start, we'll measure the trigger pull weight just to let you know what we've got now. And I'll be honest with you, when we get done, it's going to be heavier, but it's going to feel real good. Well, it's just about 2 3/4 pounds. It'll probably be 3.5 when we get done, but it's going to feel real good. 3.5 on a rifle of this type is certainly plenty light. Now, on this gun, I don't think we're going to have to do anything about it, but on some guns, some AKs and some guns of this design, you can't make the secondary sear bump into the hammer before it lets go off the primary unless you build up some weld here. It just depends on how the system is developed and how much they've chopped off. But we want to see to it that, to ensure that the gun doesn't multiple, that the primary sear system is almost fully engaged before the secondary system lets go. On this gun, we have quite a ways to go. Now watch this. The secondary is releasing, the primary catches, and yet we have that much more engagement to go. So if I move the secondary sear system, the disconnect, forward, it will hang on longer. And moving it forward, of course, will make it bump into here on the hammer sooner. And that's what we want. We want it to bump into that just before it lets go. So on some guns, we may well have to weld up either the hammer or the disconnect secondary sear system in this area here, one or t'other. Depends on whichever is the easiest. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to smooth the sliding parts, and I'm going to smooth the disconnect here and the hammer back here where they make contact. And then I'm going to move the disconnect forward by cutting off some of the things that metal that limits how far forward it can go. You see, I'm going to move it then toward the hammer when it's in the at rest position. I'm going to take the gun apart and show you again what we're going to do. I have the sear and the hammer out. I'm going to show you the parts that I'm going to stone. The trigger grabs the hammer on both sides here. I'm going to polish both sides of the hammer and the trigger where they make contact here. I'm also going to polish the hammer back here, and you can see where it's abraded, rubbed, where it makes contact with the disconnect. I'm going to polish the corresponding part on the disconnect. I'm going to polish the underside of the disconnect here. I'm going to stone or polish the underside of the primary sear here. And then I'm going to remove some metal from down here underneath the disconnect where it makes contact with the trigger and stops its forward motion. I'm going to move that forward, in other words. And the idea is to get it move forward until it'll still let go of the hammer when it backs away, but when it comes forward to pull the trigger off and let the hammer fall off the primary, the secondary system will make contact with the hammer just before it releases. And we can do that by jockeying things back and forth. I think this is going to be a pretty straightforward, easy one. So I'm going to start the smoothing process. First we'll stone the hammer. And I hold the stone, I don't use the vise, I hold the stone and push the hammer up against it hard, and that holds it flat. Now what happens, since I'm pushing hard, the two together hard, it keeps it in alignment even though my hand moves. I'm pushing so hard with my finger on the part against the stone that the stone and hammer stay in contact. For me, if I use a vise, I get the angles wrong. I just want to smooth this up. I don't want to change any angles, because if you remember, it was positive and it was light. So I don't need to make it any lighter. Now, if I really wanted to make it heavier for some reason, I would make in this case, the trigger more positive, which of course would increase the weight because it can hammer back down some more. But we don't want to do that either. We're happy with the way it is at roughly 2 3/4 pounds. I've stoned both sides of the hammer where the actual primary sear catches and holds at this area right here. Take the roughness off. It's not important to get every little glitch out of it. Just get the high spots off. That's what you're going to feel. So I'm also going to stone this surface right here, which is where the secondary sear or system catches, grabs, holds it. The release will be a little bit smoother. It's just frosting on the cake. It's not really necessary. Well, I've been stoning away. I'll show you what I've done. Basically, I've stoned every part that makes contact during the cycle of the hammer and trigger mechanism. This is the full cock surfaces. I've stoned both of those. I have stoned to smooth the surface that the disconnect slips off of. It grabs here and holds and slips off. I've stoned this part of the hammer where it hits the disconnect and pushes it out of the way on the cocking mode. I've stoned this part of the hammer where it hits the trigger when it cocks with the trigger unpulled. I've stoned the disconnect where it makes contact with the hammer, and I've stoned the disconnect under here where it's the actual secondary sear system. Then I've stoned the top of the trigger where the hammer hits it and pushes it out of the way when it's cocked with the trigger unpulled, and I've stoned this surface, which is the actual primary sear let-off surface right here. Now, I believe that I mentioned this before, that the angle of the primary sear system was positive, that I wasn't going to change it. Be careful of that. If it's right when you start, don't change this angle here and don't change this angle here. Because if you do, you're going to make it less positive or more positive depending on which way you go. If it's right right when you start, then don't change it. Murphy's Law, if it works, don't fix it. And that's basically what you do here. Also, on this particular trigger job, we don't have to take off a lot of metal. Remember, we're going to remove the high spots, but every little glitch doesn't have to be taken out. It's still going to feel pretty good. Don't get stone happy and don't get belt sander happy. Remove a little bit, try it, remove a little bit, and try it. I've been doing this for a long time, so my guessing is better than yours as you start out. But I still screw up sometimes, and I get too confident and take off too much metal, and then I have to readjust. The next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to take off some of the metal here on the disconnect. I'll put this on the trigger so you see again how it works. It is this surface right here that's the limiter. It hits the inside surface of the trigger and limits how far the disconnect can pivot. Well, it doesn't pivot far enough to hit the back of the hammer before the primary sear system lets go. I'm going to stone some of this off and allow this to tip further and hopefully hit the hammer just before it lets off. So I'm going to do an educated guess and grind off some stuff and we'll put it back together. Now, word of caution, the first time that you do a trigger job on one of these kinds of guns, use a stone or a file on this area. When you get more confident, more experience, then of course you can put on the belt sander and go for broke. But don't do it the first time. You might be real sorry. I'm going to change that. I said you might be real sorry. I'm going to change that to you'll probably be real sorry. You notice that I sanded and looked to make sure I was keeping things straight. This is what I've done. And from the side, you can also see a change in the angle. See, I've changed this angle, steepened this up. Because when it fits in the trigger, only the tip touches. So I don't have to cut all that metal off. Just saved a bit of time. Now I'm going to reassemble it. Next time you see it, we'll test and see what we have. Well, folks, the gun's together. And I have once again been a lucky guy because it's almost perfect. Nothing's perfect, but it's as close as humanly possible. I'll turn this around so you can see it. I pull the trigger till the disconnect hits the trigger. Now watch. I'm against it now. Watch the trigger move. When I pull it, it's not going to move very far. See that? Isn't that dandy? That's a distinct stop. You hear it stop. And watch the trigger. Almost no movement in the goes. It's great. I haven't even lubricated. And lubricate it, and we'll check the weight, see what we have. But this trigger pull now is quite nice. We know exactly when it's going to go off. And everything else worked. Don't even have to check the safety, although I always do. I haven't changed anything. So if the safety worked before, it's still going to work. And you see it does. Now, This gun's a little bit different because it's a relatively strong spring, but you notice that the secondary sear system also cams the hammer back a little bit. It's almost neutral, but it does in fact cam it back. You can see it cam it back. Most secondary sear systems, in order to work, will have to be neutral or slightly negative. So it's this system, the one that keeps it from falling down when the trigger is pulled. Your secondary sear system on most guns will be and will need to be neutral or slightly negative. That's not a holding or let off sear. Don't confuse it. This main sear, the forward sear, the primary sear, must be positive. And on this gun, of course, it's quite positive, and that's good. Now, watch this. Remember how it was before? When let go of the trigger and the secondary let go, the primary had probably a third of the way to go before it was re-engaged. I mean, before it was fully engaged. Now, maybe 20%. Not much. See? So we have improved that. Now, I said earlier, the more you have, the better off you are. This thing takes a hit. You see, every time that you let go of the trigger, the hammer falls up and hits it, goes up and hits it. And the metal's not totally hard. It's somewhat soft, fileable, in fact, slightly bendable in some cases. So you want as much engagement as practical. I would say if you didn't have at least 60%, you don't have enough. Well, we got 80% or so now, and I'm happy with that. I did that wrong because it shows that I had almost 100%. That's not right. I let the trigger go. See? That's good. On some guns that have a sear system that doesn't have a lot of engagement, the primary sear system, and there are guns that do, you might want to have virtually 100%. On the AK, it's built to tolerate all kinds of stuff, including bad parts and out of sync parts, out of spec parts, so it's going to work. It has so much movement and so much travel and engagement that it's going to work. So on an AK, probably 50% would get you by, but shoot for 60 or better anyway. And you would do that, of course, by making the disconnect hang on longer, the secondary sear system hang on longer until the primary has more time to get under in place. We're going to lubricate this and see what we have. Now for lubrication, I'm going to use two things. I'm going to use something made by Break Free. It's just out recently called Grease Lightning, and it just sticks like crazy. It's probably the best for stainless steel because stainless doesn't have pores, and so lubricants tend to wipe off. This stuff tends to stick. And also I'm going to use moly because moly embeds in the fine pores in steel. And moly is good for stainless, but I think probably the Grease Lightning will be a little bit better for stainless steel, but I still use both, and I use both here too. So I'm going to lubricate the primary sear system. And for the heck of it, I'm going to do the secondary sear system just because I don't want it to wear. It's not necessary that I do it. And then I'm going to lubricate matching parts on a hammer. Then I'm going to take my Grease Lightning and give it a shot of that. I'm glad that Break Free came out with this because I really am impressed with it. And we'll weigh the trigger pull. Remember, it's 2 3/4 when we started. It's going to be heavier now, but the heaviness is going to be the second sear that we now have to compress the sear on the disconnect or secondary sear system. Okay. It's now 3.3 pounds, or just slightly over 3.3 pounds. It feels good. And that's plenty light for a rifle of this type, isn't it? Now, if we wanted to make it heavier, we can make the primary system more positive. If it was too heavy, we can make the primary system less positive, but never go to neutral, never go to negative. Well, that wasn't so bad, was it? Remember to go slow until you get used to it, and you won't get in trouble. After you've done a couple, or not a couple, but after you've done 50, you'll probably hit it like I did on the first or second try, and I did it on the first try, but I was lucky. It usually takes me 2 or sometimes 3 tries. So if it takes you 4 or 5 the first couple of times, don't worry about it. It'll come. Well, I've had a good time. I hope you have. And I'll see you in the next lesson we have. Talk to you later.